a very difficult task to follow, Roger, because everybody knows that historians, like vegetarians, are very cruel people. Um, because if you say anything to them, and it's okay, Roger, I'm a vegetarian, so it's fine. Right? But it's kind of scary because the minute you say something, they can actually tell you why you are saying this and what made you say this because you are a product of some time or the other. Yeah. I'm sorry? And who else has already said it, right? So I have no grand ambitions for this presentation, given that I have 1 hour and about 50,000 stories. But I wanted to show that I can use Prezi. And I wanted to start actually with the premise of the problem, which I had kind of glimpsed at earlier. So I'm going to provide 2 sections to this presentation, where the first section I'm going to lull you all to sleep because I'm going to go into some sort of theorizations about problems that we had in trying to work with this peculiar term called the digital natives. For that first 20 minutes, I'm going to read from notes because when I start trying to explain a problem, I generally end up creating a problem rather than talking about what happened. In the meantime, there is a collaborative Prezi presentation which has been made by about 150 people from 3 continents altogether. I'm also been told that I should install you into a culture of distraction. So whenever you think I'm being particularly boring, concentrate on what's happening there. So the images and the text over there has nothing to do with what I'm reading right now, right? So let's see what happens within that mashup environment. But before I run out of time, let me say that we basically started this project called Digital Natives with a Cause about 3 years ago. And when we first began our research into the digital natives discourse, practice, and policy, my first thought, like all good literature students, was about Shakespeare. There was a reason, because if one is persistent enough, one might be able to prove that William Shakespeare actually coined the term digital native. However, the dubious claim goes to Mark Prensky, who developed digital natives as a way of identifying a new demography for a market to focus on. According to him, and then many others who mistook his description as definition, populations born after the 1980s at face value, there have been contributed to the growing discourse on digital natives. They haven't always used the same phrase. Digital natives, Generation Y, Strawberry Generation, Born Digital, Wired Generation, Mobile Maniacs, Technotots. The litany of names is long, and each one has a particular set of expectations and anxieties around a group of people who are growing up with new technologies, which are largely digital and web-based, and recalibrating the existing human-technology society relationships in ways that almost always seem novel and unprecedented. And yet, as Shakespeare wrote, that we call a rose by any other name shall smell as sweet or stink as much. And that's what has happened with the digital natives. So instead of focusing on the semantic and epistemic problems with the name, which is about splitting code and hair, I begin with looking at digital natives as a placeholder, an umbrella term that accommodates all the different characterizations of a generation that is growing up digital. Because despite the difference in naming, the methods of understanding or analyzing these populations and the frameworks through which they are understood, they remain unchallenged and often contained in vocabulary and perspectives which are analog and unable to account for the succession of changes and the rapid evolution of information and communication technologies which are produced across the world in varying degrees in the last decade. In the initial study, which was authored by me and my colleague Sunil Abraham, which is titled Digital Natives with a Cause, that initiated the research project, we found that despite the many books, articles, editorials, policies, and approaches taken to understand the usage, adoption, deployment, and integration of digital technologies by young users, the core group of ideas was startlingly homogeneous. Almost all discourse, whether in theory or practice, concentrated on a few select stories. The names changed, the locations changed, but the stories remained the same. And then these stories were inadvertently placed in a small, white, English-speaking, yuppie population that had extraordinary access to digital and internet resources, even when compared with their own peers in their own countries. These superstar narratives produced a set of non-dialectic dichotomies that put the users in a bind. On the one hand were narratives of euphoria, where every new gadget, every new tool, new instance of adoption and use or abuse was celebrated as ringing in the new, the ushering of the age of dawn, the euphoria almost couched in the language reminiscent of the promise of the revolution in the early 20th century. These superstars are going to change the world, reconfigure the universe, live in digital data streams, and cure all that is wrong with our society. They are the champion of causes, they build new economies, they overhaul societies, and they produce new, active, involved humanitarian governments, researchers, scholars, practitioners, parents, and all of them have celebrated this growth of this population, which is also always painted as liberal, progressive, passionate, and committed with a cause on their sleeve. The euphoria narrative is countered by the growing tales of despair. Disciplines as varied as sociology, anthropology, youth studies, media studies, education, neuroscience, and medicine have now vigorously produced stories of apathy, where again a bunch of superstars, this time notorious but still with star value, stand in for the deep and dire dangers that these young people are facing for themselves. They are addicted, distracted, lack political consciousness or empathy, and are so seduced by the immersive webs that they are neglecting their apportioned role in societies. Parents lament about how their teenagers no longer talk to them, like they ever did, and how they prefer to escape in violent video games. Teachers give sound bites about students with failing grades who lack concentration powers and spend their time reading things on the net, rather than burying their noses in the thick volumes of Huckleberry Finn that they should be consuming. Governments are worried that the lack of control they have over the remix and piracy cultures that most of the young technology users are involved in is leading to a stage of rampant anarchy. The screenagers are on the brink of an apocalyptic world which will be run by multinational information organizations which cater to their information and gratification needs and keep them dissociated from all sense of reality and politics. Both these narratives propel the discourse around digital natives in predictable directions. They help form policies that are pro-censorship and surveillance. They inform practice at a meta and an everyday level, which is geared towards rehabilitating the digital native into an analog world. They force the digital natives to be productive and a part of the neoliberal economic paradigm that ICT-enabled globalization is championing and seeks to eradicate downtime or slacktivism or slack time. At the heart of both these were contradictory approaches. However, there is a common set of concerns that remains. The research inquiry that we started, the Digital Natives with a Cause Knowledge program, identified these common concerns and in there recognized the problems both in methodology and framework which have been used to study, understand, and analyze the field of digital natives. The first and most significant problem is that most of this discourse is actually produced by people who make no claims or have none to be digital natives themselves. Scholars, practitioners, policymakers who are not only unfamiliar with the technologies but are often confounded by the usage and adoption produce their anxieties, euphoria based on their imagination of the technology rather than an understanding of the everyday relationship that they offer. The approach has always been one of finding extraordinary tales, using older devices of fact-finding and storytelling as means of accessing the unintelligible and the incomprehensible, making it into a population argument, rather than accepting it as a personal problem of understanding. I know this position sounds uncharitable, but it stems from a whole 3 years of frustration in trying to wade through literature which doesn't just seem to make sense, not only to me, who makes no claim of being a digital native, but also to people we work with who actually make claims to be digital natives. It is one that needs to be taken, especially when one hears constant narratives of addiction, danger, and escapism. The cacophony of anxiety-ridden narratives produced towards self-glorification as the savior of this new population continues to populate popular media. I like that phrase, populate popular media. The evidence is always based on a small sample of users who are not even often representative of their own peer groups. This ties in immediately with the second problem, that the young users who become the native informants for these projects remain only that, bearers of information and practice, which is heavily mediated by political agendas. It is very rare for a young user of technology with his or her own point of view to be a strident voice in this field. Sure, there is a huge effort at including the young in these processes, but most of the times they become mimics to find legitimacy or simply tokens of participation without any significant power or voice. Like in earlier native studies, the digital natives find themselves subjects of research, placeholders for abstract ideas which do not relate to, connect with, or try to understand their everyday practice and relationship with technology. The discourse is subject to buzzwords like access, adoption, usage. They remain contained only as people who use technology instead of people whose lives are structured around the new paradigms of technology. The third problem around which this position, this articulation is kind of structured is then about what constitutes a digital native and why we choose to stay with this category, despite the problems it offers so easily. As you can imagine, the problem is manifold. On the first level, it deals with the questions of authorship and ownership, of legitimacy and power, because the existing definition of digital natives are actually descriptions which favor a very small percentage of the population that is online. On the second, it probes at the causes that the digital natives espouse. Is any user of technology a digital native, or is there a way of mapping transformation, both at the level of subjectivity and the social, where a digital native becomes one? In other words, can we start escaping the age-bound, youth-centric discourse, though it's possible that it will be the young who still dominate this discourse, and think of the digital native as intrinsically bound to the idea of a change? The third, and more at the level of the identity politics and philosophy, is can we define the condition of being digital as transcending the interface ideas of access, clicks, and high tech, and start focusing on how the politics and aesthetics of new technologies have material consequences which help us better understand and define what it means to be a digital native, especially one with a cause. It is this discourse that this articulation is in response to. An exhausting account of all the different interlocutors is impossible, perhaps futile, and is not being attempted. Instead, it is focusing on some of the common unquestioned presumptions and positions that the discourse has taken. In the process, it shall also look at the learnings from the Digital Natives with a Cause knowledge program and have an alternative frame of understanding this field, combined with new processes of producing knowledge, might help us in look at this relationship between young users of technology, as opposed to young people who use technology, and the changing notions of change in a rapidly digitizing world. So we started with the whole question of a found name. It's not a name that I coined. I wish I had. Would help in a lot in my career, but didn't. So we had a found name and we had to work with it. I kind of go back to one of my favorite stories, which is Alice in Wonderland. I think I messed up my prezi. Sorry. Wanted to go to Alice in Wonderland and this encounter that Alice has with Humpty Dumpty for the first time in the looking glass. And I just want to read out a little bit of it. "Don't stand chattering to yourself like that," Humpty Dumpty said, looking at her for the first time. "But tell me your name and your business." My name is Alice, but it's a stupid name enough," Humpty Dumpty interrupted impatiently. "What does it mean?" "Must a name mean something?" Alice asked doubtfully. "Of course it must," Humpty Dumpty said with a short laugh. "My name means the shape I am, and a good, handsome shape it is too. With a name like yours, you might be any shape almost, right?"
This is the best reading I've ever heard.
Thank you. In an ideal world, names are coined by the people who claim the names. In the regular world, most names are coined by people who need to make sense of people who are different or not like them. Digital natives is no different. Over the last decade, the name digital native, or a variation thereof, has been bandied around by many different stakeholders to refer to a plethora of practices and populations. There has been some critique made of the name. The name obviously exoticizes the users of technology. It produces a very clear digital divide which is never really very clear, and favors those who have unlimited and privileged access to high technologies. It does an even bigger disservice to the immigrants who were actually the people who shaped and designed the early internet. It reduces the user of technology to merely a consumer, or if you want to keep in with the marketing lingo, a prosumer of technology, with more interest in the content and the networking rather than in fundamental issues of privacy, openness, politics, collaboration, etc. There were, in fact, more reasons to search for an alternative name rather than stick with this particular nomenclature. In fact, some of the spaces that have championed and indeed popularized the term digital natives, a lot of them in North America, a lot of centers which sound like us, have already moved in search of another name which will be more neutral and describe the population that they're trying to study and understand. But there's a certain politics of disengagement and disavowal here which we were very, very uncomfortable about. To disengage with that name is to try and pretend that the name does not exist, that it has not been in currency since at least 2 decades now. To disengage is to gloss over a legacy and fail to see the basic problems with the nomenclature and usage and move on to something else. Most problematically, to disengage was to go and search for yet another name which would, in due time, produce equal amounts of problems. We decided to recognize that there is a violence in epistemology. To name is to identify, but to name also means to complain, to set limits, to define, and then try and make intelligible the object being named. It seemed to be a double loss then, because to disengage would mean to dissociate from the history, which with all its faults and problems still informs our contemporary understanding of digital native. It would also mean that we would be searching for another name that the population we are trying to engage with will not contribute to. Because the need to name is the need of the researcher, or of the practitioner, or policymaker, and not of the person who's being studied. Hence, any other name, to go back to the rose, would stink as much. From this condition, an interesting discursive realization and process started. We started looking at the very presumptions that go into the making of a digital native. The discourse is filled with descriptions of who a digital native is. Actually, it's more oriented towards what a digital native does, but we can extrapolate from them. And then there are a few common sets of presumptions that emerged. Some of them I hinted at earlier, which was that digital natives are necessarily young, that they're supposed to grow up with digital technologies, that they create mythical worlds where analog technologies are not a part of their psyche. The digital natives had linguistic, cultural, economic, and geopolitical resources to be constantly connected on the information highway, creating multiverses and forging networks, staying in a parallel, if not an exclusive immersive web environment. This was the baggage that we found. We couldn't find a lost and found center, so we just carried it around with us. We decided to start dismantling these assumptions and layer, nuance, question, stretch, and morph this found name with meanings that were not necessarily present in the early descriptions. It was a way of reclaiming and appropriating the name, this time producing an epistemic violence, but on the people that, not on the people the name was tagged to, but to the name itself, forcing it to open up to new interpretations and processes of meaning making. Instead of beginning with an idea that X is digital native, and then going out in search of technology superstars to fit the bracket so that X marks the digital native, we began with a different process. We said digital natives does not mean anything in particular, but who are the people who find resonances with this name, and how do they relate to it? What are their imaginations of being a digital native or about becoming one? What happens when somebody finds a found name which is not of their own coinage and has perhaps negative connotations, but still holds on to it for something which has value for them? What is this value? How will they interpret it? And more importantly, if the found name is not a definition, but just a placeholder, how will they claim it to mean what they want it to mean? Drawing inspiration from Humpty Dumpty again, who told a bewildered Alice once again, when I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. We decided to use the found name digital native to see what we can choose it to mean, and then found partners on the way. So a digital native is not perhaps just a user of digital technologies. Oh, what is wrong with me? Okay, my computer's hung now. Yay for Windows. Right? A digital native is not perhaps just a user of digital technologies, but a person who has realized the possibilities and potentials of digital technologies in her environments. There was a need to stop talking about digital native as anybody who has access to technologies and start imagining it as a privileged, conscious, and reflexive identity. This particular crafting of the digital native identity was then clearly linked to the idea of a cause. It suggested that the digital native needs to be defined by her causes. However, this is not an exclusionary position which demands that only the young who can validate themselves as agents of social change or who can carry the legacies of existing social movements will be identified as DNs. These causes do not have to conform to any one definition of good or bad. They can range from something as personal and leisure time as collecting rare edition books and scouring for them on eBay to bringing about huge social change in the condition of minorities. And with about the 110 participants that I have worked with, there have been participants who were significantly instrumental and have become poster children in Tahrir Square, to participants who do nothing more than write a nice photo blog about the things that they see in everyday life. The cause is just a site where the subjective transformation resulting from the presence of digital technologies and an integral relationship with them leads to recognition that their lives are significantly restructured because of the relationship. Such an idea defies now, for once and for all, the youth-centric, age-based, discriminatory discourse of those who are born digital, and instead offers an alternative about those who want to become digital. This also puts to rest the old virtual reality, real life debates that have haunted cybercultures for about 4 decades now. It seems common sense that these kinds of artificial divisions would have been dropped off by now. And while they are not ostentatiously talked about, they do resurface every now and then in disguised forms. The latest, when I was writing this, was in the series of well-intentioned editorials by Malcolm Gladwell. Somebody brought up his name yesterday, whose editorial in New York Times, I think, "Why the Revolution Shall Not Be Tweeted," stands in example for a whole lot of less impressive writing, which introduces the problem of VR and RL, that's virtual reality and real life, continuously. Let's look at very quickly what Gladwell was saying in that much circulated editorial. He talks about a student movement of 1960s against racial discrimination, where the denial of service to one black student in a restaurant in the USA led to a massive mobilization of black and sometimes non-black people to come out in protest. Gladwell uses this as an example of a real revolution, as against the Twitter revolution in Tehran. While Gladwell's point of how just being on Twitter is not going to lead to a revolution is well taken, one almost thinks fondly that had he been around in the 1960s, when the real revolution took place, he would have written another editorial titled "Why the Revolution Shall Not Be Written." His current position seems to suggest that the digital natives only tweet and that nobody actually participates in material practices of mobilization, protest, and subversion. The problem with this kind of position is that it imagines a surgically cut world where the clickers on the web and the marchers on the streets are two different bodies. They confuse the tools of mobilization with the site of protest, the physical, geopolitical, or the context, and hence come up with positions which not only fail to understand the role of technology, but also add to the smug idea of the digital native as a slacktivist who only exists in digital realms. One wonders why Gladwell cannot imagine how much more powerful, how much more far-reaching, how much rapider the 1960s revolution would have been if the original sit-in student protester could have checked in on Foursquare and mobilized communities about what happened to him then there, inheriting what is generally known as a friend of a friend structure. Another Gladwellian presumption is that social movements only operate on deep ties of trust, which means that this conference is a waste of time because we haven't known each other for 20 years. Belonging and personal relationships as opposed to the weak ties on Facebook and Twitter where you don't know half the people on your list. This idea of the social movements as being run and orchestrated by a small set of superstars does great disservice to the everyday supporter who actually becomes the wealth of the movement because there is strength in numbers. He fails to understand perhaps the powers of networks, the strength of lurkers, the possibilities of tapping into people who might not be like us, who we do not know, but can still be mobilized to support a cause and hankers about perhaps a nostalgic, romanticized past where wars were won by generals and not by armies. This is the baggage that the name has come with, and it's time to unpack it. It is time to let go of this demand of only identifying champions and time to focus on the everyday digital native. In the paper that I have circulated, I have more examples or rather a theoretical understanding of what I mean by an everyday digital native. It's also my only pretension to knowledge because I quote Foucault in it, which makes everyone happy. But just trying to look at then what I've already said, but looking at what the theoretical implications of it are in terms of articulating a new language, a new vocabulary. And I'm drawing from Foucault in his extraordinary pronouncements about the questions of the role of the savior in modernity, for example, the constant quest for a messiah, the histories that need to be reconstructed in vocabularies that have been lost to us. But I'll leave the reading to you later if you have the time, well, and the inclination, right? So I'm going to stop this part of the presentation here, which was to just read out to you the kind of problems that we had, which can now get summarized so nicely in like 10 minutes, but it took us 3 years to try and figure out what to do with this. A lot of soul searching and problems, which were kind of a part of it. So this is the story of Backdoor Boys. How many people are familiar with this phenomenon already? This is Chinese boys lip syncing to Backstreet Boys songs. No? Let's have a look. I think it's brilliant. I think each conference should have at least one Backstreet Boys song played in it. So I'll do the honors. And let's have a look at the video first.
You are my fire, the one desire. Believe when I say I want it that way. And we are two worlds apart. Can't reach to your heart when you say I want it that way. Tell me why it ain't nothing but a darling. Tell me why it ain't nothing but a mistake. Tell me why I never wanna hear you say I want it that way. And mine, your fire, your one desire. It's too late, but I want it that way. Tell me why it ain't nothing but a lie. Tell me why it ain't nothing but a mistake. Tell me why I never wanna hear you say.
Okay, I'm going to stop the video because I want to show another video that they have, and which is even more exciting than this. I think it's right. I'm just showing this because this is the first one, and because it's very strange because it's going to be an Indian guy who's going to talk about something that happened in Taiwan using videos that were produced in China. The shorthand story of this is that these two guys, the smaller one with his broken hand that you saw, had a broken hand. And they were bored in the dormitory one day and they started doing these things. This is the first video that they produced. For anybody who thinks this is easy, try it. It's incredibly hard to have a static full frontal camera and placing yourself in front of it and lip syncing to a language which they don't speak. Right? They don't speak English. They don't know what the lyrics are. It's fun that they became incredibly popular. On YouTube, in the first 2 weeks, they had more than 20 million hits. They eventually came up with an entire YouTube album. This is a new one, so they keep on removing it, and so you have only like a small number of hits right now. But this was uploaded very, very late. There are many copies of it and so on and so forth. They became really big, so much so that of course they dropped out of formal education. They started their own celebrity Kuso shows on Channel V and MTV, which are still running 5 years down. They became the brand ambassadors for Motorola, and they featured on Oprah, which I'm guessing is the highest pinnacle of popular culture and publicity, right? If you look at the kind of responses that are available to these people down on any of the discussion forums, which is largely by a Western audience in English, I'm sure they will pose the same questions as you do, saying, how can idiots like these become superstars? There is no skill. They only make funny faces and they sing along. It's not like they're producing the music, producing cover versions, nothing. And you can try it off and saying, oh, it's parody, oh, it's novelty, once in a while because it's a Chinese person singing Backstreet Boys songs, it's funny and it won't work again. So there was a whole lot of discourse around it. As a response, they actually decided to come up with a local popular number and then did a whole album around it. And I wanted to show you this video because it's really, really funny. Also, there was a lot of theorization about them being queer, them being together. Also, if you notice that there was a third person in the video who just keeps on playing Quaker all the time, and everybody wanted to know what is he doing because he features in all those videos just playing his Counter-Strike and Quaker. So here is a strange video where they take up a very popular Mandarin language duet between a man and a woman, and here's a reproduction of that, which I think is really cool. And after that, I'll tell you what we learned in terms of understanding the locatedness of this particular cultural production.
想赶快。是我们眼睛丰富太可爱，还是有上天安排？是我们本来就是那一类，还是舍不得太快？是那一切约定了没有来，让我哭得像小孩。是我们急着证明我存在，还是不爱会发呆 ？Baby， 爱，否则快要从何而来？爱，否则悲伤从何而来？爱，否则我就失去未来。好像是社会有些不能自己很失败，可是。
Right, so we'll stop it, but if you search for back dorm boys, not as back bum boys that Larissa tweeted, you should be able to find a whole lot of videos for them. I think this one was interesting because it becomes less obviously funny, right? It's no longer Backstreet Boys being lip synced to. So, for a long time, like many other audiences, I was only reading elements of parody and questions of virality into this, saying here is an object which became popular and novelty value became viral. And because we live in the age of reality television, people like this can become famous. And it was only when I was in Taiwan for a significant amount of time, and then my language teacher was also a hip hop dancer. And for the university cultural festival that they have, she wanted to orchestrate a then popular Hindi Bollywood number, and she needed my help in trying to understand what the lyrics were, what the emotions were. For people who know Bollywood, it was Kajrare Kajrare with Aishwarya Rai Bachchan and Amitabh Bachchan. It's like huge icon. So they did like these months of practice put into this beautifully sculpted Taiwanese young women who were dressed in fairly erotic Indian costumes and dancing to an extremely popular Bollywood song. While they were performing, a series of not very mainstream desirable bodies of men wearing white martial art robes suddenly entered the stage. These were the kind of men you would generally classify in America, I guess, as nerds or geeks. Right, like wearing their Harry Potter spectacles, and people who are pale and have been spent in significant time in libraries, like all of us. And in the middle of the dance performance, they just entered in and they started doing all kinds of strange martial arts activities, and then trying to imitate the girls and failing miserably at it. The dancers did not mind it. The audience did not mind it. The guys were definitely having a lot of fun, and there was a whole lot of applause for everyone. And as you know, somebody who had now become like creative patronage for that particular performance, I was very dumbfounded about what's happening there. That was my first insight into this peculiar idea of kuso. Kuso is the Japanese word for shit, but it also has a certain political edge where it talks about making shit out of everything and making everything out of shit. After the depression in Japan, there was a huge intake of kuso in popular cultures and references, including in video games, where you have games which cannot be played beyond the first level. It is humanly impossible. You would need 15 fingers and 6 hands in order to play that game. But you just keep on playing it as a survival strategy until you die, right? So there is a certain celebration of being flawed, of being non-heroic, and of being, well, not very masculine in the way in which masculinity is constructed in different parts of the world. For a particular generation in Taiwan, which is called the strawberry generation, again, it's another word for digital natives, kids born after the 1980s who look like foreign imported strawberries. They are pink and fluffy and fed on American money, but under pressure they are going to crush very easily. Right? They are called the strawberry generation. For this particular strawberry generation in Taiwan, kuso has become the only form of cultural negotiation and political identification which is available to them outside of democratic and electoral politics. Somebody else was talking about earlier, and I also want to tie it up with Iti's point about saying that if there is a certain articulation of politics which is beyond the state, which is not the state as a central recipient of the political demonstration, then kuso becomes a form of that. It takes up many different forms of 30-year-olds dressing up as Hello Kitty and not speaking, because Hello Kitty in its original avatar does not have a mouth. She only makes squeaking noises. And they go days along in a group only making squeaking noises as a sign of protest. It can also be found in certain kinds of Stephen Chow movies, for example. Has anybody seen Kung Fu Hustle, Gods of Kukri, and things like that? Where the hero is a buffoon, an idiot, an undesirable, flawed male protagonist who through divine intervention for a temporary period becomes larger than life and solves the problems of the generation and then goes back into becoming an idiot, which is when he actually gets reintegrated into the society. Yeah? So a different kind of reading started emerging in trying to locate this digital native practice as Kuso. For us, it was very interesting because it also broke and fractured this idea of digital native homogeneity which is across the world, which is to say that if you're all on Facebook, you must be doing the same things. That if you're all on YouTube, you must be responding to things in different ways. And how we started locating then the realm of the cultural, which was my first provocation in the beginning, about how a dismissal of the realm of the cultural like this as only entertaining, only stupid, only fun, sometimes misses out on the very, very grounded politics of what's happening there. So the new grammars perhaps are not going to be in represented objects, because if you look at all the videos on YouTube, like you can put this right next to the Numa Numa boy. Does anybody know him? He's more familiar.
Yeah.
The fat boy who sings Numa Numa songs. Search for that as well.
I'll put it up on the.
Yeah, on that Twitter. Thank you. So they might look the same, but then the kind of articulations, ambitions, intentions, affective relationships that people have in circuits of production and consumption as well as distribution was one of the first ways by which we thought, let's keep this name, but then let's constantly bombard it with things which it cannot accommodate. Let's keep this name, but let's reappropriate it in such a way that when you use it, you cannot use it without a series of qualifications, saying that this is what I mean when I use this word. And I think in many ways, it is as problematic as other categories like queer or women, which is where some of our tropes were coming from, to take up a word which is sometimes pathologized, sometimes has a negative connotation, to reappropriate it, and then fracture it so much that it has to mean something only if we imbue enough meaning into it. Right? So I'll stop here because I'm running out of time and maybe we can have a little more discussion time. But I'm proposing that either after today, if people are not tired, I have more stories and videos to show, so maybe we can sit together during the coffee break or maybe after once we go back to the hotel or find some time on the weekend. And I would love to share some of the more things. So by the way, one of our participants in the workshop is the guy who sits behind and plays Counter-Strike. And I have stories to tell about what he's doing there as well. But yeah, I have other stories about something called human flesh search engines. I have stories about where the hell is Matt Harding, who is a dancing nomad. We have stories about the Pink Chaddi campaign. Anybody who has love for pink underwear has to come and speak to me about this, right? But I'll stop here right now and maybe we can have some more discussion time.